So it's good to EC everybody this morning. Welcome to IMCW's virtual Center for Mindful Living. Welcome to Treasure Hunt. My name is Skooglund. Can everybody hear me okay this time? Yeah, okay. Because I'll put in my earphones if that helps. That has my mic, but anyway, so in this class, as you most likely know, we explore the 2,500-year-old teachings of Buddhism's early tradition as they're recorded in what's known as the Pali Canon. One of the goals of this class is to understand as best as we can what the Buddha himself and his earliest followers thought and taught about how to lead a human life. The material that built up over the Buddha's 45 years of teachings, it's vast. And we've been using the curriculum prepared by Buddhist scholar Andrew Olinsky to guide our way through it. One thing that I hope we've been able to accomplish with this class since we started it 3 years ago is to show how these teachings, although they can be thick with terminology and fairly archaic, on their face, they actually mirror our lives, right? They mirror our direct experience, and then they go on to help us negotiate that experience. They go on to help us negotiate our lives. The Dvedhāvitakka Sutta is one of the next teachings in Andy's curriculum. It's the 19th sutta in the collection known as the Majjhima Nikaya, the middle-length discourses. The Dvedhāvitakka Sutta is translated as the Discourse on the Two Kinds of Thought, two classes of thought. Now, I sent out a little earlier in the week a translation by someone named Bhikkhu Sujato, which had the English version, but also a section in which the English was intermixed with the Pali. And I don't know if anybody cared to dive into that, but there are some key terms that I might want to spend a little time with as we get into the material. So here's the basic outline of what we find in this teaching. I'll start out with an outline and then we'll take a second pass and dive a little deeper. So the teaching starts with the Buddha talking to his Sangha, the monastic community. He's talking to them about the period of time before he was the Buddha. Back when he was a bodhisattva, the Sanskrit and Pali versions of the same word. That is somebody who is intent on awakening. And during that time period, he got this idea. The idea was, why don't I classify my thoughts into two kinds? First, those related to sense desire, to malice and cruelty on the one hand, and those related to renunciation, to goodwill, and to harmlessness on the other. So we have three kinds of thought, each within these two kinds of classes. And then he said that, as he meditated, if there arose a thought of desire, ill will, and cruelty, then he reflected. These thoughts, these applications of mind, they create harm. And then as a result of these reflections, those harmful thoughts subsided. And then the Buddha introduces what I think is a key phrase. He says basically, whatever you frequently think and dwell upon, that becomes the inclination of the mind, the inclination of the heart. That is, if we often apply our minds in these directions, then thoughts of that nature are what tend to come up. They become the habit of the mind. And after that, the Buddha introduces a simile. It's the time of the year, the end of the rainy season when the crops are ripe, and there's a cowherder. And what the cowherder has to do is to tap and poke the cows to keep them from wandering into the nearby crops and eating them. Because if he lets the cows eat the crops, then he gets into a lot of trouble. After this simile, the Buddha outlines the flip side of the coin. And he says that if, during meditation, a thought of renunciation arose, or a thought of goodwill, or a thought of harmlessness, then he saw no harm in it. In fact, he reflected on the benefits. And yet he said that if he spent too much time thinking and reflecting, it would tire him out. It would tire his mind, tire his body and agitate his mind. So he stilled his thinking and brought his mind into unification. This is one way of terming what happened. And then the Buddha repeats this key phrase again. Whatever you frequently think and dwell upon, that becomes the inclination of the mind. So that if we often apply our minds in the direction of freedom from sense desire, if we often incline the mind, we often apply the mind rather in the direction of goodwill and non-harming, then thoughts of that nature are what tend to come up. They become the inclination, the habit of the mind. And then the Buddha continues with a flip side simile. In this case, it's the end of the summer and the crops have been taken in. We still have the cow herder, only there's nothing for the cows to go after. All the crops have been taken in. So now the cowherd can relax. He can just relax under the shade of a tree and just keep an eye on the cows, knowing that they're there. The Buddha then describes how, being in this relaxed state, he entered into and progressed through each of what are called the four jhanas. You may recall this from the last teaching we engaged in. As a result, it said, his mind became purified, bright, flawless, rid of corruption, pliable, workable, steady, and imperturbable. And he extended it to what are called the three knowledges. Here we're getting, we're getting kind of technical with the four jhanas, the three knowledges. Hang in there with me. The first knowledge was that he saw his own past lives. Second was that he saw how all beings are reborn, they arise according to their actions. And finally, he experienced the Four Noble Truths, which is dukkha, the cause of dukkha, the end of dukkha, and the path leading to the end of dukkha. And with that, his mind was freed. So you may recall this as being the progression that happens near the end of the last teaching we did, the fruits of the contemplative life. Okay, so that's the broad outline of this teaching. Now I'd like to get into the specifics a little bit more. So again, the time period for this teaching is before the Buddha's awakening. And the Pali word, in the Pali itself, we see the word bodhisatta, which is somebody who's intent on awakening. And during this time period, he got this idea: why don't I classify my thoughts into two classes? And what we see here is that the Buddha to be, he's experimenting. And he hasn't got it figured out yet. So he's just, as I like to say, sometimes he's playing around he's saying, let me try this, let me try that, and just seeing what happens. And I think that this is a good approach for us to take as well, because if we bring this energy of playfulness to our practice, it can create a really healthy sort of energy, enthusiasm, that comes from experimenting, and hopefully we benefit from the enthusiasm and energy that comes from learning. Learning a new skill, learning something that we didn't know before, or didn't know in a deep way. So after that, the Buddha then describes the two kinds of thought. After he's decided to class his thoughts into these two kinds. First, there are those thoughts related to sense desire, malice, and cruelty on the one hand, and those related to renunciation, goodwill, and harmlessness on the other. This format, it sort of echoes the pairs that we encounter in the Dhammapada, which is, I said when we did that last class, they aren't so much set up that way to create a system of duality, a system of dualistic division. Instead, I think the intent is to set before us, for our reflection, the vast array of choice points that we encounter. And why these particular pairs? Why couldn't there be another set of mind states to consider? One thing is that you may recognize renunciation, goodwill, and harmlessness. They make up the second part of the Noble Eightfold Path. That is right intention, or skillful intention. Samasankappo is the Pali word for right intention. Another translation of samasankappo might be appropriate purpose. In that these purposes, they align with the purpose of the path. But as a starting point for exploring what helps and what hurts, the set doesn't portray, the full range of human experiences, right? There's a lot more going on in these hearts and minds of ours, right? So this list, I don't think it's meant to be a comprehensive portrayal of our mental life. It's definitely not. Instead, I think it's how the Buddha was experimenting with things that do have a big impact. Or maybe they were, the states that were affecting the pre-Buddha at the time of his practice. So he decided to experiment with them. And for us in our own practice, we might use these as a jumping off point, and then reflect for ourselves on the wider range of states that come up within us. States that get us entangled, and states that free us up. Another thing that I think helps to note is that we find a word in the text, viharato, which means living, abiding, dwelling. It's actually the same term that we encounter with the term Brahma Vihara, abiding place of the divine ones. Now, for better or worse, these states, they create the internal environments that we inhabit, right? The worlds of experience we live, abide, and dwell in. They form our reality. I'm going to try to share my screen here real quick. Oh, Christine, I think you might need to give me permission to share. Thanks. Okay, can you all see this now? Okay, great. So this is the English Pali version side by side. So what I wanted to point out was this Pali word Vitaka, which is highlighted here. It's a word that we actually find quite often in the teachings. Here Vitaka is translated as thought, which has the connotation of the inner verbal chatter that we engage in. But I think it's important to keep in mind that more generally, Vitaka refers to applying our mind to something. All right, Vitaka is what applies chitta to an object. Chitta meaning this heart mind of ours. Vitaka applies heart mind to a theme. So it's got a pretty important place, within us. So one way to think about it is that in order to think about something, we have to apply our minds to something in the first place. Right? And in this sense, it's got a relation to mindfulness. In that, mindfulness is what we bring to mind. It's also got a relation to attention. That is, what we focus on in any given set of circumstances, within any given environment. So I want to offer just a couple quick thoughts about each of the three pairs. First, there's sense desire. The Pali word is kama vitaka. It's this word right here that I'm highlighting. One thing to note is that this is kama with one M. And if I was pronouncing it correctly, you could tell that it was something different from kama, with the kama which you might hear more often, which has two M's and is correlates to the Sanskrit word karma. Okay. We also find kama in the first of the five hindrances. Kama chandam is the first hindrance. We also find kama in the asavas, you may remember from that text. So we have the kamasava, that is the mind flowing to the five senses, being compelled by, attracted to the five senses. And that's what kama refers to, the five senses. And not just the five senses, but the desire for experience at the five senses, ear, nose, tongue, and body. I also recently saw one teacher fold the 8 worldly winds into sense desire, which I think is a really helpful thing to do. Just because it's possible to spend a whole lot of time applying our thoughts, applying our minds to the themes of, and here they are, pleasure and pain, gain and loss, praise and criticism, and having a good reputation and not a bad reputation. Again, that's pleasure, pain, gain, loss, praise, criticism, fame, and ill repute. So as a theme of reflection, it can be sobering to consider how much of our mental energy, might be devoted to getting the 4 pleasurable inputs, 4 pleasurable wins, and avoiding the four painful ones. The second kind of thought that the Buddha worked with is malice, ill will. Here's the Pali term, Vyapada Vitaka, right? And just as an FYI, Vyadapam is also the second of the five hindrances. So we're seeing quite a little bit of overlap here. Broadly speaking, this refers to aversion or revulsion of any kind, toward people, objects, situations. The next kind of thought is cruelty. Here we have that here, Vihimsa Vitaka. Himsa, just this part of the word means cruelty. And the vi part here, it's sort of a multiplier. So vihimsa means really cruel, right? So it's that kind of energy we get when we want something not so good to happen to somebody. So those are the three forms of vitaka that get us into trouble, and here are the three types that help us. The first is renunciation, or the term that gets classed as renunciation. That's this term right here, Nikema Vitaka. And what again, it gets translated as renunciation. It's literally it means something along the lines of absence of sense desire. Now, this is the one that historically gives us problems. It gives the early texts a really bad reputation, because here's the deal, right? Getting as much sense pleasure and sense stipulation as possible. I mean, that's one of the big reasons we want to be alive, right? At least that's the priority of part or parts of our brain, parts of our mind. Well, one of the things that the Buddhist tradition points out, actually quite a number of other traditions do as well, is that there are ways of finding happiness and satisfaction in life that don't have anything to do with mundane sense pleasure. Renunciation, like I said, gets a bad rap, but it doesn't mean that we renounce happiness. Instead, it's that we find happiness in ways that aren't as typical, you might say. The Dhammapada verse 290 points to this. That verse says, if by giving up a lesser happiness, one could experience greater happiness, a wise person would renounce the lesser to behold the greater. So while being angry, being filled with dislike, if we think about it, we can feel our way into it and realize that it's painful. Experiencing the dukkha of an awesome meal or a beautiful sunset, or wanting to get outside on this beautiful day, that's a bit more tricky because they're part of a whole class of sense experiences that are obviously not painful. They're obviously not painful. But what puts them into the class of dukkha is that they're impermanent. If we rely on them, it can't be helped that they will eventually fail us. And or we have to put a whole lot of time and energy into lining them up, concocting them. Just something to consider. The fifth type of thought that we're working with, that the Buddha was working with, is goodwill or non-ill will. It's this term right here, Dvedhāvitakka. Dvedhāvitakka is simply a negative form of Dvedhāvitakka. We add the A in the front. So it's literally just a negative form of ill will. So it's non-ill will, but it often gets translated into its positive form, goodwill, as Bhikkhu Sujato did. Harmlessness, or non-cruelty or compassion, is the sixth application of thought. Ahimsa is the Pali word, which you can see right here. Again, we add an a in front of it to counter the Ahimsa that we saw before. And again, this often gets translated into a positive form, compassion or harmlessness, as Bhikkhu Sujato translated it. One interesting thing to point out, ahimsa, ahimsa is the Sanskrit term that Mahatma Gandhi applied to his system of nonviolence. And as you probably know, this was picked up by Martin Luther King, in our own civil rights movement. And the point I want to make is that, even though we in the West, we have trouble engaging with the numerous negative terms that we find in the text, in their original forms, they do point to something positive. That they have a positive effect. So the next part of the teaching is that the Buddha, as he meditated, when there arose, as there arose a thought of desire, ill will, or cruelty, he understood these thoughts, these applications of mind, it is said, they lead to hurting myself, they lead to hurting others, they lead to hurting both. They block wisdom, they're on the side of anguish, and they don't lead to extinguishment. They don't lead to liberation. He said, when I reflected on this, thoughts of sense desire went away, thoughts of ill will, thoughts of cruelty went away. So what's happening is that, there's a clear understanding, and then there's a reflection, and then there's a release of what causes harm. On the flip side of the coin, it says that during meditation, when a thought of renunciation arose, or a thought of goodwill or harmlessness, when they arose, he understood that these thoughts, these applications of mind, they do not lead to hurting myself, do not lead to hurting others or hurting both. They nourish wisdom. They're on the side of freedom from anguish, and they lead to liberation. And he realized, if I were to think about and consider these thoughts all night and all day, I see no danger from that. That said, he offers us this interesting qualification. He says, but if I thought and considered these things for too long, it would tire my body and stress my mind and take me away from being composed and settled. So I dropped the thinking and stilled, settled, unified, and immersed my mind. So there are a couple things going on here that I think are worth pointing out. First, the Buddha is noting that in his pre-Buddha existence, thoughts arose, stuff came up. And he's not saying that I've decided to have a thought of ill will. Instead, it just came up. And as you might know, I like to note that the Buddha once said that this mind of ours is more variegated than the animal kingdom. And as many of us know firsthand, we do have a real zoo inside of us. But what the Buddha did with this zoo is figure out what's harmful and what's beneficial. He says that he understood each one, that as he reflected further on the harm of some thoughts, the harmful thoughts diminished, and the beneficial thoughts, he let them go on. So what's happening here is that it's not that the Buddha is simply engaging in some narrative recitation, about what's good and what's bad. And notice that he's not giving himself a hard time, about having this or that thought. He's not feeling guilty. He's not giving himself a lecture, and he's not pretending that the hard stuff is not there. What he is doing, though, is reflecting in a sincere manner, truly seeing, having the felt sense of what the results are when we incline our minds in certain directions. Now, in one sense, he is letting things be, to use contemporary language, and he's not, and yet he's not remaining passive, right? He's not going to make himself content with what causes harm. What the Buddha is showing us, is rather than use brute force or use what we call willpower, we can instead recondition ourselves. We can adjust our perceptions. We can adjust our value system, so to speak, to diminish attraction, to actions that cause harm. And he has us bring to the forefront the beneficial results of other courses of action. This is how right effort flows out of wisdom, rather than discipline. I was recently prompted to reflect on the meaning of responsibility. And it's funny, this can get a little tricky because we can take on that concept in ways that might not be so good. So, like when we ponder the first line of the Dhammapada, all experience is preceded by the mind, led by the mind, made by the mind. It says we make the experience that we're having, but that can come across then, since we're responsible, that can mean maybe that it's our fault, if we're having a bad experience, which is kind of a hard way to look at it. But I think the most helpful way to view it, and I actually encountered this in a YouTube discussion about free will. That was actually the prompt that I spoke of. Someone in the video pointed out that responsibility means response ability. That is the ability to respond, as in, we can choose. This was also Viktor Frankl's great realization. If you've read Man's Search for Meaning, he famously said, it is the last of the human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose one's own way. Now, along those lines, what the Buddha is lining up for us is a process of anticipating, a process of feeling our way into the results of certain courses of action and then making choices accordingly. And then, one of the great choices, we can make in this life, one of the great reflections is, what kind of mind do I want to have? So next in the sutta, after each of the pairs, after each of the three applications of thought, we find this key phrase. Whatever mendicant, a monastic, frequently thinks about and considers becomes their heart's inclination. Or to put it another way, whatever you frequently think and dwell upon, that becomes the inclination of the mind. So if we often apply our minds in certain directions, then thoughts of that nature are what tend to come up. They become the habit of the mind. And back when I taught kids meditation, I'd ask them to consider that whatever they do, think, or say, whenever they do think or say something, they're giving themselves practice at it. And whatever they practice a lot becomes a groove, becomes a habit of mind. And it determines, what becomes strong in their mind and how they experience life. So what we see throughout the early texts is that the Buddha was proactive about things that cause harm, and he was proactive about things that bring benefit. And this is the fundamental aspect of right effort, I think, the four parts of which go like this. We guard against the arising of what's harmful. We abandon harm that has arisen. We create beneficial states that haven't arisen yet. And we develop beneficial states that have arisen. So after each of the pairs of thoughts, we have a simile. And after the section on sense, desire, malice, and cruelty, the Buddha describes the scene in which it's the end of the rainy season. It's the time of year when the crops are ripe. And there's a cowherder. And what the cowherder does in this situation is to tap and poke the cows to keep them from wandering into the crops, and getting in trouble. And by extension, if the cows of our own mind, wander into the crops and feed, we understand the harm of that. We don't allow them to wander into the field and cause damage. And then after the section on renunciation, goodwill, and harmlessness, the Buddha continues with the cowherd simile, only this time it's the end of summer, the crops have been taken in, and the cowherd can relax. You can just keep an eye on the cows, just knowing that they're there. So this is the first section of the teaching, and in my mind, it's the core part. What follows is that the Buddha then describes how, being in this relaxed state, he entered into and progressed through each of the four jhanas. After having entered into the concentrated, settled states of jhana, it's said that, with this mind being purified, bright, pliable, workable, imperturbable, he extended it to the three knowledges, at the end of which he woke up. So I just want to say two things to end the talk portion of our time together. First is that I know I spent a lot of time. I didn't spend much time on the actual content of the thought. I kind of breezed over that a little bit. I spent more time on the process, which I hope was a helpful thing to do, teaching us a process. And ironically, I spent really virtually no time on jhana, but I invite you to reflect on the role that settled awareness has in our practice. Now, we may not come into full-blown jhana, although if you were here for the class with Mary Aubrey, I hope that opens up as a possibility in your mind that might not have been there before. So we may not hit jhana, but I just personally, I'm saying this, I'm really reevaluating the value of composure and collectedness in my practice. And I think that's what this teaching points to when it says that, we get our minds to the point where we can enter these states and really open up the insights. We need insight in order to compose the mind, but once composed, it's a whole different ballgame. It's a whole different set of insights, the depth of which are completely different too. That's one value of the composed states. The other is that they're just so satisfying as a way to be alive as a human, to have the mind, be composed and collected. I want to offer you all a somewhat lengthy reflection to follow up on this teaching. And then we'll have time for questions and discussion at the end. But before we get into any reflections, are there any questions or comments that would be really helpful to get out right now? We can address those. Yes, Alex.
You said that you haven't spent time on the jhanas, and the jhanas are the training of the mind, if I understand the term correctly. Is the coming reflection a jhana, a training, or is any training a jhana, or is it more specific?
Yeah, jhana actually refers to the last of the Eightfold Path. It's the 4 forms of highly concentrated, highly settled states of mind. So training might be more, it might be more in the realm of bhavana, you would say. But jhana is it's a unified state of mind where the mind is just highly composed and collected.
So I think of training as learning, whereas a jhana sounds like you have learned this state.
Yeah, jhana is something that comes out of having abandoned the 5 hindrances, as we saw in the teaching on the fruits of the contemplative life. He built up a number of steps before we got to the hindrances, which are desire, ill will, restlessness, torpor, and doubt. Those 5. Once those are absent, then it's possible in our meditation to enter the four states of jhana, which if you need a refresher, I believe that one particular talk is still online. And as I said, Mary Aubrey walked us through it in a way that was just tremendously helpful, I think. And again, hopefully it opens up it's not, jhana is not something that gets taught a whole lot anymore. It is making a resurgence, which I think is great. But I'm not saying the reflections that I'm offering could lead to jhana, but it's not something that in most of our lives, the way most of us typically live it, it's a little hard to do just, right on the spot. I hope that helps. Yes, Emily.
So the ideas about looking at each thought and how it either does or does not lead to extinguishment. Could you perhaps give a different word for extinguishment? I mean, why that word's picked instead of, I don't know, extinguish, you blow out a candle, death. I'm just trying to illuminate that phrase for myself.
Yeah. I believe the term extinguishment didn't happen until the very end. What the Buddha the term he was using more at the beginning in relation to these thoughts was whether or not they cause harm.
Right. It does or doesn't cause harm.
Or lead to, or it does not lead to extinguishment. Yeah.
Correct. Yeah.
So and that's why I tried to use the term liberation. Liberation is not a word that was actually found in Sujato's translation, because when you see that term extinguishment, it follows on the way of thinking that they had back in India at the time, and it had to do with a simile or the metaphor of fire. Fire being, if you look at fire, it looks agitated, and it was thought to be attached to or clinging to its fuel, right? And with liberation, with extinguishment, the fire was in a way not so much extinguished, it was thought to be released. So that's another way of translating that term, and Thanisaro Bhikkhu likes to use the term unbound.
Great.
To describe that state.
Yeah, I hadn't clicked on that nuance. Thank you.
Yes, Kathleen.
Am I muted?
You're good now.
Okay. When one thinks about renunciation in the context of the things that many of us find the most satisfying, would it be fair to say that it is skillful to experience them without relying on them? Making a distinction between going to a concert or looking at an art object, but not requiring it in one's life in the sense that we rely on it for our happiness? Or is that trying to oversimplify the issue?
I think for those of us who are not monastics, when we have a social life, we're in this world. I think the way you put it is good. It's just a matter of reliance. If we have to have a beautiful day, if we have to get out of the house and get to the art museum and have a certain set of experiences, we're setting ourselves up for failure. But if we can sort of reasonably and moderately, come into these pleasures that are just part of life, then there's no problem with that. It's kind of funny that the Buddha actually was given a hard time by some of the other renunciants of the age, because he would get invited to have meals at some of these places, and some of these meals were luxurious. And, the Buddha didn't decline because he wanted to avoid, very pleasant tasting food, but, he didn't, he didn't make that his purpose in life. He didn't depend on that for his ultimate well-being. Okay, shall we have a little bit of a sip? Okay, so yes, this is the time to put these teachings into practice, a little bit of an opportunity. I'd like you to consider this to be your time, to connect the teachings, and whatever happened to make sense this morning, apply that to your direct experience in the next 20 or 25 minutes. And I will offer some words to reflect on, but please ignore them if you like, and just use this time however you see fit. But to begin with, you might like to attend to your physical posture, make any adjustments that you like. Let your eyes close if you like. Come into a posture that is upright, yet relaxed. And as part of this, you might like to take note of your surroundings, taking in sounds, just becoming aware of your environment. And take a few moments to get a comprehensive sense of all your physical sensations. You might also like to take a moment to note your mental posture. Note what the current character of your mind is. What kind of state is your heart in? There's the state of your external environment. There's also the state of your internal environment. Are there any thought patterns, moods, or emotions that are prominent?
Yes, this is she. This is not a good time. I will make a donation.
And while maintaining a general sense of your external and internal environments, take a deep breath. Breathe in and feel your body. Breathe out and relax your body. Breathe in, feel your body. Breathe out and relax. while maintaining an open awareness. Breathe in and feel your body. Breathe out and relax your body. For many of us, it might be typical that our attention, our awareness, our intentions are scattered, chaotic, perhaps subject to the whims of our external environment or our past conditioning. With this practice, we chart a different course, carve out for ourselves a different version of reality, experiment with different possibilities within ourselves. So with this practice, we incline the mind to be collected rather than scattered. Aware rather than entranced, engaged, but not entangled. We incline the mind towards the kind of happiness that comes from within. From having our hearts and minds be settled, composed, tranquil. We breathe in, become aware, we breathe out and relax. You might find it helpful to find some aspect of the body or the breath that feels pleasurable. What part or parts of the body or the breathing might feel good right now? Find that place in the body where the mind would like to be. Let the mind dwell there. And if you find that the mind can settle there, you might find it also helpful to note that there's a pleasurable aspect of the mind being settled. So we acquaint ourselves with pleasure within the body, and the pleasure of the mind being composed at rest. Even as one part of the mind might value this aspiration, might value this experience, you might find that other parts of the mind would like to wander. They might want to flow in the direction of sense desire or aversion of some kind. This is quite natural, but we don't need to leave it unquestioned. As part of our practice, it's a basic part of our practice, we might compare the felt sense when the mind is clear and collected, or scattered and flowing. So you might use these moments of practice to come into the felt sense of what helps you and what does not. And to whatever degree you can in these moments, let the inclination toward what's helpful become stronger within you. Take firm root and deepen within you. Breathe in, breathe out. Relax the body, compose the mind. Again and again. Making this capacity for internal peace and happiness strong and reliable. Well, thank you all. Realized that I forgot to load myself up with my bell. I find that bells don't translate well on Zoom anyway, so. Oop.
Thank you, Carl.
I hope that was a helpful follow-up to the teaching.
Wonderful.
We do have a few more minutes. If there are lingering questions or comments.
I had one, Carl. Oh,
Yes, hey, Rich.
So the word reflect on, contemplation, that sort of thing, in the course of meditation. Just what, could you clarify the technique?
Yeah,
Like a lot of times, like I was taught that when you have a thought, you just label it thinking. Well, I've expanded that a little bit. I'd like to look at what the thought was, or to briefly recognize what the thought was, and then check my body to see if there's a corresponding feeling. And that's proved to be beneficial to me. But exactly, can you talk about the technique of reflection during meditation?
yeah, this is actually a really good debate. You do hear different versions of the role of thinking. From what I can tell from reading the early texts, the Buddha didn't have a problem with thinking. Except that, like he said, that if you think too much, it can sort of lead away from being settled. So don't turn it into a problem, but it's so easy to get enchanted with as well, and turn into an exercise in and of itself. I think of reflection as sort of clear present moment, full body thinking, you might say. You think and you know that you're thinking, rather than being dragged around by some sort of compulsive thinking. That being said, at some point, we let that go and just come into something in which the chatter doesn't need to be there. We can we can take our hand off of the edge of the pool and swim for ourselves without relying on the blah blah blah.
That's good. I like that.
It's something to experiment and play around with, as
Well, one thing, it's so much more fun to let your mind go running through the zoo.
And one interesting thing too is that the thoughts, they can, we can give our primary attention to some pleasurable aspect of the body or the breathing, and thoughts may start to percolate in the background, and they may come and go. We don't have to feed them. And then, they might find some other pathway out of our experience. It's, again, just it's such a wonderful thing to experiment with.
Thank you.
Mhm.
So Carl, would this be a good time for me to do?
Yes, I think so. Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, okay, so we're glad you're all here and grateful to Carl for these presentations, which he does of his own free will and without compensation. And so if you would like to support the work of the Center for Mindful Living that presents this and many other things, I have posted how you can contribute financially. And I have also posted the calendars of events for both the Center for Mindful Living and the Insight Meditation Community of Washington, as well as the link to where you can listen to this talk and other talks of Carl. If you are not on the Center for Mindful Living email list and would like to be, you can put your email address. You can send that to me in the chat and I'll add you so that you can. And Carl announces every month the upcoming theme in advance of the class, so you can. So you can get what he's going to talk about, and you can get he attaches the readings. So is there anything else? I think that's it.
Yes, just Christine alluded to it. I don't take any of the dana that you offer. It's not something I need to support myself, but whatever you feel compelled to, whatever way you feel compelled to respond, giving any benefit you may have gotten from the teachings, I sure would appreciate it if you pass it on to CML to help support the facility. All right. As usual, it's been great to be with you all. Thank you.
Thank you, Carl.
Thank you, Carl.